As was briefly touched on in the first video this week, there are a number of conservation-related concerns about non-native species, particularly those that can be considered invasive. In this video, we will outline some of the key concerns about non-native and invasive species. As was mentioned in the first video this week, there is a distinction between non-native and invasive species. In fact, most non-native species will not become invasive when they arrive in their new environment. In most cases, the new environment is the wrong set of conditions for the non-native species to gain a major foothold and be able to maintain a viable population. So they either don't survive for very long, or they maintain low population numbers. But despite this distinction, there are some conservationists who believe that all non-native species, not just those that are invasive, need to be controlled or ideally removed in order to protect native species and ecosystems. Remember back to a few weeks ago when we discussed the debate around the new conservation movement. The idea that conservation can, and indeed should, work to benefit humans, particularly those that are the most vulnerable. If you'll remember, one of the most vocal critics of the new movement was Michael Soule, who was also heralded as the godfather of modern conservation biology. Well, Soule wasn't just mad about the changing focus of conservation. He also had strong feelings about the new conservationist beliefs that non-native species can make valuable contributions to their new ecosystems, and that these displaced species have a role to play in conservation. As you know, Soule fiercely defended the biocentric position of conservation right up until his death in 2020, but he also defended a particularly nativist approach to biodiversity conservation, as he felt that non-native species should not be afforded any protection under conservation. He even went as far to say that they should not be accounted for in measures of biodiversity. To him, the new conservationists posed a threat to biodiversity, and in particular unique and rare species. He often referred to the new conservationists as the gardeners, people who were content to turn the whole planet into one large garden, full of whatever species make people happy, rather than those that keep the planet and its systems functioning as they should. Others, like E.O. Wilson, view the acceptance of non-native species by conservationists as a sign that they're giving up, that they're waving the white flag and accepting that the battle for conservation has been lost. To them, all non-native species pose a threat to conservation simply because they didn't evolve within that system, and those evolutionary and ecological processes that produce the native system need to be protected. Let's set the arguments for the eradication of all non-native species aside, at least for now, and focus just on those species that become invasive. While it is true that many non-native species will have minimal impacts on their new environment, some will be able to thrive and flourish, and these are the ones that are most at risk of becoming invasive. And there are certain properties of a species that make it more likely to become an invasive species, and make it more likely that they will be difficult to control and contain, therefore posing a threat to conservation. First, invasive species tend to have high rates of reproduction, which allows them to become established in a new area very quickly. For example, purple loosestrife, which is considered to be an invasive plant species in Canada, has been estimated to be able to produce up to 3 million seeds from just a single plant. A second common trait of invasive species is that they have few, if any, natural predators in their environment. Newly introduced species are often free from predators and disease, which are two major factors that keep species populations under control and in balance with their ecosystem. Finally, invasive species tend to have the ability to thrive in different environments. Most invasive non-native species are generalists, meaning they can survive in a variety of different habitat types and climate regions, and they do not have overly specific food preferences. In addition to some species being more likely to become invasive, some places are naturally more vulnerable to the arrival of non-native species. Their conditions just make it more likely that a new species will end up becoming invasive. Islands are particularly prone to invasions because they tend to have few strong competitors and few predators. For example, many birds on small islands have become flightless over time in the absence of predators. So when a new predator does arrive on the island, these birds have no defense mechanisms to deal with the new danger, making them particularly vulnerable to extinction. Aotearoa, or New Zealand, is a perfect example of this. Dogs and rats were first brought to the islands by Polynesian sailors in the 13th century, and cats were introduced later by European colonists. This has had a devastating effect upon the native wildlife, particularly the birds, as many species native to the islands are flightless. The further an island is away from the mainland also increases the chances that there is an open niche in the system that a non-native species can rapidly fill and possibly exploit to become invasive. Disturbed habitats such as roadsides, clear-cuts, and urban environments are also particularly vulnerable to invasive species. Non-native species, particularly those that are invasive, have environmental, social, and economic impacts. They are a major threat to biodiversity and are often listed as one of the biggest drivers to the biodiversity crisis, right up there with habitat loss. Let's look at the environmental, social, and economic impacts of invasive species, starting with the environmental impacts. As previously mentioned, many invasive species do not have a predator or disease to keep their population in check, so their populations often explode, getting very large very fast, which may cause extensive changes to the structure, composition, and distribution of native species. In some cases, it may even lead to the extirpation or even extinction of some species. For example, zebra mussel populations have exploded in the Great Lakes since they were first observed in the late 1980s, and have taken over virtually every hard surface in some places, including rocks, boat hulls, and even on the shells of native clam species, which has drastically impacted these species' populations, reducing their ability to feed and increasing their mortality. On land, Japanese knotweed has had similar effects, as once it becomes established in a disturbed area or along a stream bank, it only takes a few years for it to push out virtually every other species of plants that was once present. Invasive species can also be the cause of a phenomenon known as genetic pollution, which is the unintentional hybridization and introgression that leads to the homogenization or even replacement of local genotypes because of some fitness advantage conferred because of the presence of the new species. Basically, some individuals may be able to better adapt to the new environment created by the presence of the invasive species, so they're more likely to survive and reproduce, leading to a reduction or even disappearance of the genotypes that are less able to adapt to the new environment, and a loss in overall genetic diversity. Invasive species may also gain a foothold in their new environment by breeding with some of the native species, creating hybrids, which may ultimately end up replacing the original native species that was found there. An example of this is found in the lakes of the Rocky Mountains in the western United States, where native cutthroat trout have become at risk because of hybridization with the non-native rainbow trout that were introduced for recreational fishing purposes in the late 19th century. In some cases, invasive plant species like kudzu and garlic mustard can lead to soil degradation and erosion or even alter fire cycles. For example, in western North America, in parts of the Mojave Desert, an invasive annual grass called Bromus tectrum has increased the fire frequency in some regions to the point where the native shrub steppe community cannot recover fast enough, and these species and those that rely on them for forage and shelter, species like the sage-grouse and prairie falcons, are quickly becoming at risk. Some conservationists have also raised concern that invasive non-native species are fueling biotic homogenization, which is the process by which two or more spatially separate ecological communities become increasingly similar over time. The concern is that certain invasive species are becoming cosmopolitan. Their ranges are being extended to most, if not all, regions of the globe. This is a particular concern in urban areas where studies have shown that ecological compositions are becoming increasingly similar, as a result of a handful of species like dandelions and pigeons taking hold in cities around the world. Invasive species may also have impacts on human communities, as they and their control mechanisms can have public health implications or can hinder recreational opportunities. Invasive species and the mechanisms used to control them can have long-term implications for public health. For example, pesticides, herbicides, and other chemical treatments are one of the most common ways that invasive species are controlled, but they can end up polluting the soil or water, which then has the potential to cause harm to human health. Glyphosate is a well-used herbicide in forestry, agriculture, and invasive plant control in general. And although the science on the topic is inconclusive, there are concerns that it is potentially linked to an increased cancer risk. And in 2015, the World Health Organization classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans, though the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Canadian Pest Management Regulatory Agency have classified the herbicide as not likely to be carcinogenic to humans. Introduced species, like certain species of pigeons, rats, mosquitoes, and fleas, can also serve as the vectors and reservoirs for disease themselves. Throughout human history, epidemics of disease like malaria, yellow fever, and the bubonic plague have all been linked to animal vectors. As species are transported around the world, so too are the diseases they harbor, putting new human populations at risk. A recent example of this is the introduction and spread of West Nile virus in North America. Invasive species also have a complex relationship with outdoor recreational opportunities. On the one hand, people engaging in activities such as hiking, camping, and boating can inadvertently become the vectors that bring invasive species into new areas. For example, one of the primary ways that we know emerald ash borer moves around the landscape is through the transportation of firewood. Other species like spotted knapweed or garlic mustard can be spread when their seeds adhere to boots and clothing and then are trekked into new regions. As invasive plant species may alter water quality or quantity, plant and animal diversity, and species abundance, they can change ecosystems and their appearances, which may make them less desirable for people seeking outdoor recreational opportunities. For example, the European common reed is an aggressive wetland species that grows in dense, tall stands that crowd out native vegetation and restrict the movement of small animals, including amphibians, reptiles, and fish. It also alters the diversity of waterfowl that will use the wetlands, impacting bird-related human activities like hunting and birdwatching. Finally, invasive species can have huge economic consequences. First is the cost of their control and eradication, which globally is estimated to cost about $1.4 trillion each year. As an example, the cost of treating ash trees to protect them from emerald ash borer in Canada alone is estimated to be over $500 million, with the cost to treat a single tree being several $100s each time, and most trees will require multiple rounds of treatment to be protected. Invasive species can also have negative impacts on resource-based economies, including the forestry, agricultural, and fishing sectors. Many invasive plant species reduce yields in agriculture by taking up all of the nutrients in the soil. Others, like the leafy spurge, will compete with native species, pushing them out of foraging fields, or unpalatable because of thorns and spikes, like yellow star thistle. In both cases, without extensive intervention, livestock like cattle are at risk. Invasive species have led to an increased use of chemical herbicides and pesticides, which, as we discussed earlier, has potential human health impacts, but also comes with a large economic cost. In the Great Lakes region, the sea lamprey is an invasive species that can consume up to 40 pounds of fish in a single year, including species like lake trout, which is an important fishery in that region. The sea lampreys have had such a devastating effect on fish populations that some populations have completely collapsed and others are well below the levels that are required to have a sustainable fishery, which has obviously had economic implications for those who relied on fishing in the region.